We take off from where the episode leaves. But before that, I want to just contextualize some of what is happening. So in political science and political theory, there's a concept of deeply divided societies. Deeply divided societies are societies where there are very deep social cleavages along social lines, along religious lines, caste lines, ethnicity, language, so on and so forth. And when you have such deep cleavages, the question is, how does that polity exist together, right? How do you design a constitution for a deeply divided society where groups that don't see eye to eye at all continue to coexist and stay together? Because there is some give and take that is involved in any kind of a political situation. If you don't trust the other, how do you end up staying together? And political scientists will tell you that the way to do that is by designing your democracy in such a way that there is a sharing of power for all groups, right? So that all groups feel that they have a stake in the political project. If there is a group that feels that it is locked out of power, it is not going to get any power, it is always going to be subordinated, then what incentive does that group have to stay on in that political system, right? It will always be, either it will be subordinated, which anyway we don't want, or it will want to fight that subordination by trying to exit, and that will lead to instability. So to the extent that we care about a stable political order, when you have deep divisions, you should ensure that there is power sharing. That is how you make a stable constitutional order. Now this is the context in which this demand for partition, etc. is happening. So if you remember, what the British had done was they had provided for separate electorates along religious lines, right? Very famously, after the Pune Pact, the idea of separate electorates along caste lines was scuppered. But along religious lines, you had separate electorates, particularly for Muslims. Now, when the cabinet mission comes in, to see how you could move towards independence and how you could get these parties that are not seeing eye to eye to come to a common conclusion that could be the basis for the Constituent Assembly. They say that their first and main priority is to ensure that while we are moving towards a democracy, which will be based on majority rule, we should have a way of protecting minorities, right? And so the first charge, they say, on this new Constituent Assembly would be to protect minorities. So they come to a decision that they will put in some political safeguards. This is the language that is used at that time. There will be some political safeguards for minorities. Now I'll come to what minorities mean at that time, but for the moment I'm talking about religious minorities. What are the different types of political safeguards, but one political safeguard is in the federal structure, right? So there the idea is, you would have heard the word grouping here, right? The word grouping is coming from the idea in the Constituent Assembly. It says that we'll have a central government, a union government, which will have some 3 or 4 powers: defense, external affairs, communication, some 3 or 4 such powers. All other powers will be with the states, right? And states can come together and form groups. Those groups can have their own constitutions. States will have their constitutions, groups will have their constitutions. And the states can decide how much of their powers they want to give up to the groups. So if you know anything about Indian federalism today, it doesn't look anything like that. That was the idea in the cabinet mission plan. Then there would be separate electorates, which would ensure that different groups could elect their own representatives and send them to the legislature, and that would ensure that their interests were taken care of, right? So on and so forth. So there were a few political safeguards that were provided. And it's on the basis of this cabinet mission plan that the Constituent Assembly was then created, right? Now, by the time we come to where this episode takes off, the question of whether this grouping is something that Congress has actually accepted, or it is going to be subject to a decision by the Constituent Assembly where the Congress has majority, whether this grouping will be compulsory grouping, that you don't have an option to join or not join a group, you will have a compulsory grouping, or whether it will be completely optional. These questions have started emerging. And Jinnah feels that the Congress will not abide by its assurance, and ultimately he and the leadership of the Muslim League are of the opinion that they're not going to get effective power sharing with Congress, and then, as you know, partition takes place. So, but remember, when the Cabinet Mission plan was for power sharing. So, in fact, the first draft of the Constitution had many of these power sharing arrangements. It had the idea of so many structural provisions which would allow for some level of power sharing. But once partition takes place and all the bloodshed that follows, the mood of the assembly really changes. Right? So you saw a speech given by K.M. Munshi. Right? Once partition is announced, he gives a speech and he says that now we are a homogeneous country. Right? Actually, if you look at the entire speech, his point is that we had accepted a less than ideal arrangement of a weak center only because we wanted to keep the entire territory together. But now that that is not the case, basically we can start afresh, right? And we can design what we need to design. We don't need to focus on these community identities. Now we can create a homogeneous country and a homogeneous community, a homogeneous citizenry. So what happens as a result is this idea that we have to have power sharing across groups. That framing is put aside. Right? The focus now is on ensuring that there is unity in the country. And by unity I mean that it's a fragile territory, right? This is a new country. This is a kind of experiment that hasn't been done before. In a territory such as this, there are wide divisions. How do you ensure that it doesn't splinter across? And so the design focus now shifts to that. So, for example, on federalism, there's a 180-degree turn around from a very bottom-up federal order where the bulk of the powers would be with the states and the union would have very few powers. We now have a system where the bulk of the powers are with the center and the states have fewer powers, right? And that design, in fact, there are many commentators early on who used to say, oh, India is not even a federal country, it's quasi-federal, right? Well, that's debatable whether it's quasi-federal or it's federal of a different sort. But it is true that the bulk of powers stays with the center. The center has fairly extraordinary powers with respect to the states. For example, it can dismiss a state government, impose president's rule. It can change the boundaries of any state, convert the state to a union territory. We saw that in Jammu and Kashmir. In terms of the things that it can make laws about. So in the constitution, there are these 3 lists which tell you who has the power to make laws with respect to what topic. Right? So when can Parliament make a law about it? When can your state legislature make a law about it? And in that, like I said, the Cabinet Mission plan and the early versions had thought that there would be only 3 or 4 topics that the Parliament could make a law about. Everything else the state would have control over. Now that's flipped. The bulk of the powers are with the center. There are fewer powers with the states. And if there's something that's not mentioned, that's a residuary power, something that is not mentioned in any of the lists, that is with the center. So similarly with finances, etc., the bulk of the powers are with the center. So this idea that you would share power with different regions and share power with different groups through this kind of a federal division, because remember, particularly with Muslims were, while they were territorially present throughout the country, they were also concentrated in the east and the west, right? That is why federalism was seen as such an important check, but that is given a go by. And the second thing is the electoral model, right? Again, after partition, there is no appetite for separate electorates. That idea, and repeatedly, member after member says that this is what has caused this kind of division, etc., in our community, in our polity. So we cannot have separate electorates. What will we have instead? We will have to have joint electorates. So if there's one principle that comes out very clearly, it is that we can't have separate electorates. In fact, there's a provision in the Constitution, Article 325, which says as much, that you can't have a special electoral roll. No one can be excluded from an electoral roll only on the ground of their religion, caste, creed, sex, so on and so forth. So separate electorates is completely given a go by. But then people propose other ways in which there can be a representation of different groups and different communities, so that everyone both feels that they have a stake in the system, but that their views are actually represented in the system, which is, for example, proportional representation, right? That in proportion you might have, and there are different ways. They never get enough into the details of proportional representation to really figure out how that might work. Across the world, there are different ways in which electoral models are jigged, so that different communities or different interests or multiple interests are actually represented in the legislature. So, for example, in proportional representation, if you have it by virtue of your, say, any kind of social identity, then in one particular constituency, you may have, a certain number of seats that are, you might have a multi-member constituency, and you might have a certain number of seats that seats are divided according to that proportion of the population. There are other ways in which people do it, which is not tied to identity. I don't want to get into the models of electoral, of proportional representation, but just the idea that you can ensure that multiple interests are represented in the legislature, but there is no appetite for that. So the system that you get is a joint electorate system. The one carve-out that happens is for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes with respect to reservations. But it is a joint electorate system with reservations. In fact, the Scheduled Caste Federation, of which Dr. Ambedkar was the leader, had earlier rejected the idea of joint electorates with reservation, because the idea was that you would have a reserved seat, right? And so the people who could stand could only be from that reserved category. Right? But the vote would be for everyone. And so their concern was that, okay, so each such representative will have to cater to the dominant community to be able to actually win their elections. So their concern was that therefore the special needs and interests of the community for whom the seat is being reserved will have to take a back seat. So that was their concern, but ultimately there was no appetite at all for separate electorates. And by this time, the idea of separate electorates on the basis of caste anyway had been, after the Pune Pact and all of that, that was a bit of a non-starter in the Constituent Assembly. So that is given a go by. The other interesting thing that happened, and so just to say, even with political reservations, there was a deep discomfort with the idea of political reservations, because there was again repeatedly the idea that we are one citizenry, one homogeneous group. We should not be treated on the basis of our community identities, but on the basis of us all being Indians. Right? Now you can imagine if there are actually deep cleavages, and it is the reality that we are both Indians and also belonging to these different identities, which really shape how society treats us, how we are, what our material circumstances are. Then you can't say that you have to choose one or the other. But there was that dominant thread in the Constituent Assembly was that we have to protect this homogeneous, or we have to construct and protect a homogeneous Indian identity over what was seen as regressive community identities. So even with political reservations for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, it was provided only for 10 years. Right? And many, including Nehru, get up to say, I'm not comfortable with political reservations because we should have one person, one vote, one value. Everyone should be treated equally in the political sphere. But okay, maybe for a limited amount of time we can try it out, but it is very time limited. Right? So that is how this works out. A third bit, of course, was reservations in public employment and in education. Again, the idea was that the mechanics of power sharing, right? The state, the working of the state, and the channels for social mobility should be available to everyone. Right? And there should be power sharing there, so that everyone has, so that, for example, with public employment in the state, everyone should be able to have a say in how the state carries out its functions. The administration should work for everyone. That requires that everyone is represented in this system. As you know, this is not something that went through both in the Constituent Assembly, went through easily. Even then, there were concerns again that we should not be basing, any kind of reservations. But reservations, the idea was there wasn't actually that much discomfort in the Constituent Assembly. The question was on what grounds? Should it be on the grounds of caste, or, for example, economic ability, so on and so forth. So some of those threads that we are seeing continuing to this day were also present in the Constituent Assembly. And while they provided for affirmative action, there was a lot of discomfort that was voiced, again on the idea that you're privileging other kind of regressive community identities over this homogeneous secular national identity. A last point to say is that in the initial drafts of the Constitution, the word minority included both religious minorities and caste minorities. Right? As time goes on, and so in fact the first draft, for example, when it had reservations for minorities including religious minorities. But that changes over time to separate out religious minorities and caste minorities. Caste minorities do have reservations. Religious minorities, instead of reservations and power sharing, are given rights. Right? So the right against discrimination, the right to religious freedom, and social, educational, cultural rights. And in fact, there's a speech by I'm forgetting who exactly. I may have that speech here, and I can just tell you who exactly by. If I remember correctly, it's one of the people that we have read here. No, I don't have that. Oh yeah. H.C. Mukherjee. We didn't see H.C. Mukherjee in this episode, but he says this, right? There are certain people who really feel alarmed over the future of their communities. Such people want to come to the legislatures because they think they can safeguard the interests of the groups to which they belong. But when we have passed the different fundamental rights which guarantee religious, cultural and educational safeguards which are justifiable, basically you can go to the court for it, safeguards which can be decided in a court of law, I feel that the presence of people belonging to certain groups is not necessary. So instead of representation, we've given you rights, and that should be enough to take care of your interests. So this political safeguards, which is about power sharing and securing representation for different groups, gives way to a more homogeneous majoritarian electoral model, a very centralized and majority heavy federal model. No reservations, at least for religious minorities, no power sharing in public in services of the state or in education. Instead of power, you're given rights. So that is where we end up with, and you can see the extent of representation particularly for Muslims in our state institutions and in our representative bodies today, right? So the entire BJP is the single largest party. It does not have a single Muslim member. I looked before coming, and as far as I saw, there are about 4.4% of parliamentarians or at least members of the Lok Sabha are Muslim, and of course their proportion of the population is about 14%. So it's a significant underrepresentation. There is, you have the Sachar Committee report, which has really gone into great detail in showing the extent of exclusion of Muslims from various spheres of public life and their subordinated socio-economic position in the country as a whole. And of course, the politics of the present we are all aware of. And I want to leave you with the thought of what would have happened if we had provided for effective representation and not just rights in our constitutional order.